Now we are live with SCI TV. I'm Joshua Gordon, the founder of the Sports Conflict Institute. Today I'm really pleased to welcome Dr. Scott Brooks from the University of Missouri, an associate professor of sociology, and Dr. Ken Pendleton, our co-host, who's really in the sweet spot on this topic as well. So gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you, Josh. Good to be with you guys.
Dr. Brooks, it'd be great for you to give us a little bit of insight into how you got into this area of study. So what was your path that took you into this being your focus, specifically on race and sports and some of the mythology that's out there around these issues?
So one of the things that I've been trained on as an ethnographer, someone who studies culture from the inside out, is that the best stories and the best research really are autobiographical. And so really it's the kind of typical athlete who wished that they had gotten a little bit more out of it and, put their heart and soul in it and found another way to really follow that passion. And so, I was a high school athlete, played at a school that is currently ranked in the nation, Bishop O'Dowd High School out of Oakland, California. We've got Ivan Rabb, who's one of the top seniors coming out. And during my day, we played against Jason Kidd. He was in our conference, and so it was a heated battle. And so I grew up with this passion, but I struggled with my coach. And in that struggle, I eventually quit. I was one of the team captains, and I felt like we were pretty divided and that our coach had been central in making this division between races. I was essentially the black captain, and we had another captain on our team who was the white captain, more or less. And it was in those moments of frustration and trying to manage that I started to think about how things might be better if I had had a different coach. And I struggled for probably 5 to 10 years still thinking about that experience and wanting to find a way to make improvements. And I got into coaching, wasn't really deliberate about it. It seemed like things would just happen. Doing senior hours, I found myself coaching a little girls' Catholic school with one of my buddies. And then I continued on coaching just kind of here and there. I eventually went back to my high school coach and had a funny, it seemed, and so he took me in for a little bit, but yet I still wasn't ready to let go of that poor experience. And then I went on to graduate school, having been exposed to and really influenced by Dr. Harry Edwards at Berkeley. I went there for undergrad, and being a Bay Area kid, knew of him and his work. I decided at some point that I really wanted to be Dr. Harry Edwards. And so when I went to graduate school, that was really my plan, to major in sociology and to follow his path. And I looked him up after graduating, and he mentored me, gave me some advice, wrote letters of rec for me, and he's really been influential in helping in my thinking, in the way that I really talk about and think about sport and theorize inequality and race and so on. And he continues to be a great influence and someone that is really like a father figure in terms of being an academic. So, you get the athlete who has more in them and just wants to continue to follow that passion, and I found it by being an academic.
Well, let me start by trying to put this in very concrete terms, and I really like that sort of sociological approach. And so let's say, for the sake of argument, I'm a talented African American athlete who has the right physical size to become a good basketball player, and I'm from the inner city. What are going to be the obstacles I face? What am I going to have to do to become successful?
Well, so it's my newest kind of thinking is really to strip down athletes into their becoming story. And it's like anybody else. You're on this path to becoming something, and it starts with awareness. And so that awareness is everything from society, what's on television, what's in media, what you in terms of sneakers and all to these different ideas about athletes. And young black men in particular, they come to special niche in sport because this is what our society shows them, you know. So inner city, although we know better, you know, but there's all of this mythology. And so young black men in the inner city see this, they hear it, their parents are fully aware, they teach them. And as sociologist Charles Cooley said, when you're in an environment where an activity is prized and encouraged, it really helps to nurture whatever abilities you might have in that area. And so I did my research in Philadelphia, where basketball is surely prized and encouraged. Kids learn about basketball from mothers and fathers. They're taken outside and they're taught how to dribble. They're taken to playgrounds. They see the hierarchy, those old heads who get all the respect because they used to be and still have game. They see how kids are applauded and how other older men come alongside them and give them praise, maybe offer to buy them sneakers and pat them on the back and give them advice and tell them you can play with me even when we're playing with the grown men. They have strangers who will pull them aside and say, hey, you had a great game the other night. They're written about in the newspapers. And then there's increasingly rankings and numbers beside their name that highlight that this is something that is not just a local identity, but that can turn into worldwide fame. And so you get kids in Philadelphia, like in New York and Chicago and some of the other places, who can count the number of players in the NBA who have come from their neighborhoods, but could not do a similar count on the number of doctors or lawyers or professors in their neighborhood. So they really come to see this as something that's viable, even though we know that this is a lottery chance that you might become this athlete. And so you get these spaces. And so with all of this that's at stake, the possible status gains, you also have all the obstacles. Your parents getting in the way by trying to maneuver and navigate all these roads, taking you from place to place. You're getting poor advice. You're on a team where a coach favors another athlete. Maybe you feel too confident about your own ability, and so your coach doesn't like your cockiness. Just the level of competition and those others who are trying just as hard as you are, and the mounting pressure that goes along with the need to perform at the best level and really help to make your way easier. And so these are those everyday obstacles that we have, but they're magnified in this high-stakes game of youth basketball in these major inner cities where kids are really trying to get known and get to that next level.
And Dr. Brooks, one of the you had highlighted was the mythology of, essentially an innate talent versus the idea of hard work. Can you talk a little bit about that tension between hard work and just pure athletic ability and what some of that interplay is around race in particular?
Absolutely. So one of the things, and if I go back to the quote by Cooley, I love this quote as a basic sociological kind of explanation, because one of the things he says is nobody's a natural-born counterfeiter, nobody's a natural-born criminal. Instead, they have to be in places where they learn about these things. If you don't even learn that something like this exists, that basketball exists, how could you ever become a player, right? You wouldn't even know about the game. And so it's hard for us maybe to imagine, but if there wasn't this mythology, basketball players are the greatest players on the planet, then you wouldn't have so many black kids aspiring, black men in particular, aspiring to become athletes. And so even if they have natural abilities in other sports, they are going to, because of this cultural niche, this idea that this is what black guys do, right? We play basketball, we play football, don't play baseball not that cool, soccer is not that cool. We essentially put all of our eggs in this particular basket. And so you'll see different levels or different types of athleticism come through, but it's hard for us to imagine that black guys just simply aren't naturally athletic, because we look to the Olympics and we say, well, look at the Usain Bolts. I mean, we don't even have to look at Americans. And we built this up over time, and all the way through boxing, and then, of course, basketball. I always like to highlight that that black athletes are prominent, and we see them on television. And so how do you explain it? Did they just become able in 1 year? Of course not. You know, there's power, there's access that operates underneath this. And so we have no definitive research that tells us about how race operates, whether it's a one-drop rule, or, you know, that there's all things that we've heard of, this scientific racism that has operated for centuries in this discussion of distinction between races. But instead, you know, as a sociologist, I'm concerned with these sociological factors and teasing these kind of things out. And I can't refute that we, at least many of us, believe in our gut that there is a difference. But one of the things that, you know, when you look at any group, you know, we say that there's as much diversity within a racial group as there is between racial groups, because it's a social construction. And so, you know, I look at it and say, if you're going to talk about jumping, volleyball requires much more jumping than basketball. Everybody on that team, for the most part, jumps except for maybe the setter. And you see jumping on numerous occasions. I mean, they're just bunny rabbits going up and down. Basketball is a lot of running more so than it is even jumping, and yet we have this mythology that black guys just jump higher. They jump better. And so, you know, we've bought into this, and it, you know, we talk about this as fitting into this racial ideology that, you know, that undergirds our kind of society and our ideas about race.
So if I'm understanding this, what you're really saying is there are sort of filters, right, that frame how, you know, your expectations for who you are, and then at the same time that you have to be sort of negotiated if you're going to actually realize that. So I was thinking of William Julius Wilson's book on the truly disadvantaged. What you have is a kind of cultural, he called it social dislocation, but in terms of being a basketball player, you're actually very socially located, right? But in terms of being a doctor, you're very socially dislocated, right? And so the question,
absolutely,
right? So yeah, so that's, I think, is just fascinating. How does that change if, for example, you come from let's say you're African American, you come from a suburb? How are those filters going to change for you if you want to play basketball at that high level?
So the interesting thing, Ken, is increasingly our country is more suburban than urban, right? And we haven't done a lot of research on it. We still hold on to this idea that America is primarily urban. For blacks, it still is where you find the highest concentration of blacks is in urban areas. We're mapping out where NBA players have come from, right? And it's tricky because you can look at birthplace, or you can struggle to try to identify which is a hometown, is it the town their high school is in, and so on. But even if we let that stuff go for a little bit, what we're going to be mapping out is how black players particularly have changed where they come. You get the fall of Detroit, right? This inner city that is this robust city of basketball production. And so I've got to imagine that we're going to find that there's still players coming from Michigan. They're just coming from outside of Detroit. And so, you know, I don't know if it changes so much. I think that what you find, even as blacks have become more and more incorporated, we have the largest black middle class, is that, as William Julius Wilson talked about, I mean, as others have critiqued him, but he also alluded to, he wondered whether or not there was this real class separation. And what his students have found, Mary Patillo, who wrote Black Picket Fences, and others, is that black middle class often live very close or overlap with black poor and working class. And so if that continues to hold, you're not going to find much of a difference. It might be a zip code difference, but kids still generally know the best basketball is played in the city. So in Philadelphia, even the white kids from the main line, from the suburbs, come into the city of Philadelphia in the summer league to play city basketball. That's still where the basketball is played. You get middle class kids who do struggle with their identity. This question of what is authentic. That black authenticity is being thug or gangster and so on. So I think you see some sensationalized silliness of, you know, middle class kids, black kids being gangster, being thugs. You know, I think that still plays out. But that's where, as people are studying and saying, well, you know what, the NBA doesn't look as inner city, folks are wondering if that means that either people are faking they're being hard, or whether or not the NBA has changed culturally. And what I'm saying is, because our country still is largely pretty segregated, that even if you're talking about middle class, you got folks like Doug Massey and Nancy Denton in American Apartheid who said it, that it is more likely that a poor white working class family live with white middle class than for black middle class families to be living with white middle class. And so if that holds true, you're not going to see much difference. You know, you still have the same kind of things operating in terms of how we are racially segregated.
So, Dr. Brooks, how much of the influence that leads to, you know, some of the perception of you know, where someone should head and where they should put their energies in their young lives comes from role models like NBA players versus, you know, the local role models, coaches, parents, peers? So what's that balance between those two influential socialization mechanisms?
That's an interesting question, Josh. I don't know if I could put a number on it. I would argue it's difficult to disentangle because they're all a part of this same basketball world. So one of the things that really is starting to stand out for me is looking at this whole system, right? A basketball player is not the individual simply. They are all of these things. The history of basketball being reintegrated, and you're seeing black men coming of age and becoming seen as the dominant. They're the universities that reached out in the late 50s and 60s, the predominantly white institutions that went and recruited black players, and the NBA that, of course, allows for the drafting of black players in 1950 with Earl Lloyd and Chuck Cooper. That you have a pull from these big institutions and from ownership of franchises. We want one of those, was apparently the quote of the Fort Wayne Pistons general manager and owner. We want one of those. We need one of those. And you have the push from the community. So you've got all these things operating together. And you don't have one without the other. If you don't have the money, if you don't have the fame, and the promise of getting out of the inner city, you just have parents who, you know, in Wilt Chamberlain's day, although he was the first big-time paid athlete, you had parents who were just happy that it was just college. You know, before you could go to that, it would just be you go to a HBCU and, you know, that would be fine. You get your degree, you go teach often, you know, that was kind of what you did with your degree, and you just got a good job. So I think that it's hard to disentangle, but increasingly with the LeBron James of the world and starting with Michael Jordan, you know, wonderful book on the global economy based upon Michael Jordan and Air Jordan, that symbol. You just have so much more has happened. When a kid can think about not just winning and not just making it, but being a global icon. You know, wanting to be like Mike and have other kids wanting to be like you. Imagining them wearing your sneakers, the fact that you have a sneaker, the fact that you can call yourself a CEO, you know, and then the newest kind of things that we're seeing, and this isn't, you have prep schools that are not so new, but you look at a Findlay Prep in Nevada that's only been around since 2007. And if you go and you look at a school like that and you look at all the other prep schools, Oak Hill has been around for a while, but you're seeing all the rest of these prep schools that are coming up. I look at this hoop entrepreneurship, I call it. This is looking at basketball and sport as a way of branding and making money towards a particular agenda. And schools are doing this. You have nutritionists and strength and conditioning coach. I mean, we've got a huge industry now where people are so concerned with their nutrition and strength and conditioning. Parents are hiring these special coaches. You've got coaches who are, not only strength and conditioning, but they'll tell you they are basketball trainers, and they'll claim that they've either played college or played overseas or trained a Kobe Bryant when actually they may have just sat in the gym and watched him do some kind of workout. And these people are making money. So you've got a whole cast of characters involved in this socialization process. And some are definitely exploitive. They're predatory when they look to parents and they say, your kid has a lot of potential, but if you put them with me, I can guarantee that they're going to get an opportunity at that scholarship. And they say things like, yes, this may seem like a lot of money now, but this is a lot cheaper than paying for college. And so they're preying on these parents. And this whole system works because of the money, the fame, and the opportunity to kind of have something greater. It's the American dream operating.
Is it as simple, though, at this point, is there's so much money at stake eventually at the college and especially at the pro level that the system identifies the most talented athletes at a young age and essentially subsidizes them, or is there still an element of, that this, for an academy like Oak Hill or the one you mentioned, they have to, do they just take the most talented kids, or they also have to take some of the kids who pay the best? I ask because as someone who's really interested in sort of the political economy of youth soccer in this country, one of the things that strikes me is the best players are often systematically marginalized, especially if they're Latino, because they simply can't pay to play in the developmental teams. And so you have this real huge suburban bias that exists in soccer.
Absolutely. Well, so the difference here is in basketball and in football, I think you have to look at those sports separately from the rest of our American sports. And it's primarily because of the percentage of blacks and the profit that's made from those sports. So baseball, as our American pastime, made some key decisions. And you see it in the low percentage of blacks in baseball. Baseball decided not to ride on image, not to ride on players, and to stick with this idea of the purity of the game in the game. Basketball, through Sonny Vaccaro, right, the great Sonny Vaccaro, who gets Nike involved with Michael Jordan and creates all of this opportunity in college basketball for coaches to make money and to really put Nike out there in everybody's hands. He took it a direction where basketball started to get subsidized heavily in the inner city market. And football is followed behind, not quite as much. It's very expensive, and it's a little bit more spread out. It was a little harder to get to, and you have some small town kind of stuff. But those two sports have followed this subsidized model. But the other sports have not. And I think that it's about the racial dynamics there. So not just are we talking about soccer and baseball that require a lot of a huge investment from parents, but one of the things that we're trying to research is I hypothesize that women's sports are similar to what you're talking about with soccer. That because we treat women differently, we see them as lesser athletes, the sneaker companies have not invested in as much because there isn't as much money to be made. They're not going to get on TV and have these huge ratings. And in doing so, it takes a lot of investment from their parents. You're more likely to see middle-class girls, except for the elite ones, that have to pay their way. And so basketball, when Sonny Vaccaro went there and got Nike to buy into it, they started to pay for athletes, subsidize these programs. You've got the Boo Williams out of D.C. and Maryland area, and you know of these historic AAU programs that Nike still invested.
It's really interesting to me. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Because I think there's two assumptions that underlie what happens with soccer that are worth thinking about. I think one is because the people who are good at soccer are relatively small. So the best soccer player in the world is 5'7", 150 pounds. There's what I'll call an assumption of fungibility, that any kid can basically be good at it if he just got the right environmental factors in his place. Right. And then the second that goes with that is Americans have almost no cultural nous when it comes to soccer, if you will. And so they may see another kid on the field and be able to glean to some degree that he's better than their kid, but they think, one, if my kid just got that attention, he would be every bit that good. And two, they really don't have a deep understanding. So one time a famous football coach who was a friend of my family was once, after a loss, no less, the photographer said, started critiquing his, what he had done during the game, and he looked at her and he said, "Mary, why don't you tell me everything you know about football? I have 30 seconds." And a friend of mine who's a soccer coach thought that was the greatest idea ever, and ever since then, that's what he says to parents, because they think they understand the game as well as he, even though they're woefully uneducated about the sport. Whereas in the case of basketball, size is such a huge issue right away, and the odds are so stacked against you if you're under 6 feet tall, and they really only get pretty good if you're about 7 feet tall. And then the second is you have this kind of cultural knowledge that you talk about earlier. The old heads they know what's going on, and they're going to tell someone, "Look, your fundamentals are horrible. There's a reason this coach isn't playing you." They're going to give you a really honest critique. And so I think that's a really interesting comment, because I think it fits with the gender element as well, because I think there's always if there's an assumption about male fungibility, I think it's even more so in the case of females.
You are absolutely right, Ken. And I love the point you're making about size, and again, these ideas of natural. I think of it as, when we see athletes, if they don't look to be bigger and stronger than we are, particularly as Americans, if they're not bigger and stronger and somehow these superheroes, then they're not really that impressive as athletes. And so that falls in line with soccer and how we may think of soccer players, and it definitely falls in line with women. If they can't beat me, then they can't really be that good. They're not worth paying money for. And I think that you're right, that those kind of assumptions underlie our ideas about what is real athleticism even, right? So that when we look at baseball players, people often laugh and say, well, they're not great athletes. And they might look at a picture and say, well, he's got a big belly, he looks out of shape. They'll, you look at a Prince Fielder and so on. But athleticism is so much more than what we are narrowly defining it as. We've come to see it in such narrow terms. And what it does is, you get the innovations when a coach realizes, well, you know what, maybe I'm going to go with all small guys, because if everyone's big on the floor, then we might be able to run around them. Or maybe I want a guy who used to be a tight end rather than a kid who's overweight and doesn't move so much. We always thought that was an anchor. And we get these innovations when coaches start thinking differently about athleticism and what's necessary. Stuck in our male perspective and our gaze. They still remain simply entertainment. They're women to look at. They're spectacle. They're not people to be amazed by or surprised by. They're not athletes that wow us.
So one of the things that we spend a lot of time thinking about is what happens to all of those athletes that don't make it, right? Yeah. And you talked about your own story even of what it was like to not have that pan out, and then really trying to wrestle with that for a number of years. What are some of the ways we could better understand those athlete transitions? And those transitions can happen at any point, right? They can happen at any point we have a filter in where you may no longer have an opportunity to continue that path or that dream.
Absolutely. So two things, Josh. One is right now a career in sports academy. And my thought is exactly this. In working with leagues, I thought how amazing it would be if we had a career league that instead of us being out here playing basketball, kids were getting an opportunity to actually do work in a career field that maybe they don't know anything about, but that they could get excited about. And so my thought was bringing in the sports-related careers, everything but the athlete, bringing in these kinds of professionals to expose high schoolers even college kids to the realm of sports. Now, in some ways, it creates a hoop dream too. It almost suggests that there's all these jobs out there, and if I expose you and help you get you on your way, then you'll dream of these jobs. But is there a reality check at the end of the day where you won't get there? Well, my thought is, I'm a perfect example of this. That even if you don't get to be an orthopedic surgeon for athletes, you're an orthopedic surgeon. I haven't sold you a bad bill of goods, right? If you went to become a sports agent, but you become a lawyer instead and become a trial attorney or whatever kind of attorney, you still got to be an attorney. So in this way, there's a win-win regardless. But I'd like to expose kids to these other opportunities using sport as this hook, because 99% of us are not going to become that elite athlete. And we still have this love, and we need to be able to find a way to keep our kids focused, and particularly those kids from lesser advantaged backgrounds, get them focused and keep them looking for their ways out and ways to help themselves and their families. And then on the other end, I started to think of hearing about more and more reports of young men, particularly young black male athletes in basketball and football, who are committing these crimes, whether we're talking about sexual assault, whether we're talking about robbery. There was a recent, in the fall in my hometown in Oakland, about 4 guys held up some people at the share pool, the share ride, carpool kind of stuff that takes you from Oakland to San Francisco. And when they held up these folks, I'm a friend of a friend who was held up. She was really saddened when she looked at these young black men. And this is a white woman. She tried to speak to one of these young men who had a gun, and felt like his eyes softened. But then somebody else got really tough and threatened to shoot her and so on. So a terrible story. The newspaper comes out after they catch these guys, and one of them was a recent college basketball player who had lost his scholarship. Who knows the full backdrop? He's out of school, and he's trying to make a way. He felt between a rock and a hard place. Not that he made a great decision, but to your point, I wanted to know, and I would love to try to do some research to figure out what has happened to some of these fallen heroes. Right? I know from those men in Philadelphia that many go back to the promise through amateurism of a scholarship, at least that's going to lead you to a better life. I don't know that I believe it's a genuine, sincere effort by our institutions. I mean, I feel that they are really looking to make money when we're talking about those top 25 to 50 schools, and you see increasingly that coaches are letting go of players. If some of these athletes who fall by the wayside, right? What are their lives like, and what are the crimes and other issues that they're coming into? I'd love to hear the success stories, of course, as well. But I'd like to do some research or see, because in this way you get our institutions are playing a particular role. You have Ruben May talked about this as the dirty trick, the promise of that coaches rely on. They rely on this hoop dream to sell kids on coming to their school instead of going to another school by saying things like, you're going to be a star here, you're going to start all 4 years, you're going to go into the NBA. And it's not that it's all on a coach, it's not that it's all on a kid. Again, I believe that this is all working together. But these are young men, 18 years old, 17, maybe 19. And it's make some of these decisions when they're being sold this kind of stuff. And so I think you're asking a wonderful question. There are success out, get their degree and finish strong and go on to do things with their lives. But there are also these terrible stories of the young men who end up holding up somebody, feeling like they lost their way somehow. They have that huge loss of status in their community, and they've disappointed their family, who was depending on them, to make it out and to make a way for them, for the whole family, and they failed.
Right. I mean,
to your point, we did a survey with a D1 college football team, and we did it over 2 years. And the first year we asked them just a simple question: how many of you believe you're going to be drafted in the next year in the NFL, or as soon as you're eligible? And so, of the 110, athletes on the team, we were thinking that it would be something like 10-15% might say that they were going to be drafted, and in fact, it was somewhere in the high 80%. And so the next year we said, well, maybe we just need to educate them a little bit and give them more information. So we looked it up, and in fact, that previous year it turned out to be 3 of the 110 were drafted, and not necessarily in high rounds. We went back to the same team, and we asked them, how many of you, knowing this information, that last year we asked this question, here was a percentage, and here was the number that actually was, now how many of you believe that you're going to be drafted? And it dipped maybe 5 to 7%, right? Yeah. And I think about the contrast from the athletic side to what I do when I'm wearing my professor hat and I'm counseling, non-student athletes, just the general student population, and they come in with these dreams as well of being sports agents and everything else, and I spend most of my time convincing them to go into some other path, right? And yet on the athletic side, you have lots of reasons to help people have that dream. And so I love your idea about trying to think about ways you would plan for transition right from the get-go, given how much that support system that was boosting you up disappears in an instant if you're no longer part of that system.
Absolutely. And the saddest part for me is it's not just that it disappears. Sometimes when it doesn't disappear, it's the disappointment that the folks who love you, who are to have that unconditional love for you, how they express disappointment. I know young men who have mothers who have said, a mother is not working. She's been out of work for several years, and it was hard to find work. The jobs moved out of the city. Get that. She was, dislocated out of her job. All of this happens. But when he graduates, she's expecting a regular amount of money from him. And he says, Mom, I can't keep giving you money. I have to say, you need to go get a job. You can't depend on me. And she says to him, if you had only done what you said, if you had kept your word, I wouldn't be in this situation. Right? And that's heart-wrenching for me. I can judge her in particular ways, but again, it's a product of this whole system, the basketball world that says young black men out of these conditions can make it if they keep working. So it's not just that parents are selling them. You have to have the colleges who continue to sell them. You have to have pro sports, the media that tells these wonderful rags to riches stories. This keeps that whole basketball dream alive. And so it's a cultural phenomenon. And too often we only think of the individual and their families, but we have to remember that those invisible institutions and franchises hold a real part of this key as well, because they are continuing to count on this effort. If they didn't have, they would be out drumming attention, to make sure that these kids continue, except that we've got more imported players coming in. So it's almost like, hey, we almost don't need you as much anymore. We can outsource the talent. You look at the San Antonio Spurs, you look at the relatively huge influx of Canadian talent that's coming just over the border. And there's a day, Harry Edwards talks about how in basketball you're of black Americans, but in football you can't, because nobody else, to Ken's point about how other parts of the world, we don't know soccer, other parts of the world don't know football and don't care about football. And so football, we're stuck with football. And the most dangerous sport we could be in, we're stuck with that. But basketball, you can import some talent.
So, yeah, I mean, it seems like the question you're really raising here is one of cultural transformation. I think of, there's great baseball player Hank Greenberg, and when he was going to sign with the Detroit Tigers, they had to tell his parents part of the signing would be that if it didn't work out, they would pay for him to go to Columbia. And then
Right.
even when he signed with the Tigers, until he started making lots of money, the other neighbors would say, well, those are 5 other Greenberg kids. They're good kids. That 6th one, he's a bum. He's a baseball player. And so you have almost a 180-degree difference between the way, say, masculinity is being constructed right now. And I can't help but think of Allen Iverson as sort of a tragic figure. And yet he represents authenticity in as Todd Boyd has written about, in a way that maybe no other contemporary basketball player does. And I'm wondering what kind of critique there is going on among academicians and people in the Black community about how to make that cultural transformation, or whether it's
it's an interesting idea, because I continue, right at 42, almost 43, I continue to be asked if I'm a basketball player, right? And in Philly, while working on my graduate work, I remember being stopped by an older Black woman who asked if I played basketball. I told her no, and she said, "What a shame." So at 6'4½", you're at that height that when people look at you, you should be playing basketball, particularly if you're a Black male. And if you're not, then there's probably something wrong with you. And being in grad school doesn't suffice as, like, in general, for many people, it's not legitimate enough. It's not, you wasted some time when you could have just made some money. And so it is interesting to think about these notions of authenticity, to think of race, and how race is so conflated with athleticism, particularly for Black males, if this is what you're supposed to be. And this is the struggle that many young kids have. I mean, and looking at and doing my research, I didn't just look at the kids I coached. I looked at the kids who were no good and didn't come out for us. And what I found was even they felt like they had to do something with basketball. So often they'd be in the gym before we were in the gym, but they're practicing trick shots. That was their kind of identity. They're not going to beat people on the court with their ability, but I can practice these other kind of things. I can become someone who dribbles. If you remember the one 2000s, I remember one of the kids who was the best dribbler was from New Jersey, never made his high school team, and supposedly wasn't very good outside of his dribbling. Could handle the ball, but you put him, you let him loose for a shot, and he was terrible. Right, but you practice something to death. Culturally, basketball is this phenomenon, right? And so kids who are not so good, they still, young black males in the inner city still feel like they have to be connected in some way. Often they become AAU coaches, again, these hoop entrepreneurs. They become old heads. They're the hangers-on. They're promoting kids. They find this way to be involved. It's something that we have to continue to explore. How can we give our kids more options? Because I'm not against the American dream, right? That's a part of our ethos. It's the work ethic, and what we're great at in America is believing and having hope. Until black communities, no, we don't want to do sport, and you don't have any issues. Kids without athletic activities, are going to be more likely, as we see across the board, to get in trouble in school, to have lower grades, and so on. So I never want to steer them away from it. That's why my plan is this transformation, as you spoke about, Kid, is to try to find another way to use sport as this hook. And I'm just now working on this. I've got my undergraduates who are linked in. We're meeting, trying to get these high schoolers together. And my dream is to have high school kids who run basketball leagues from top to bottom, who get to practice the job of coaching, refereeing, running the table, doing promotions and marketing on the business side, practice journalism. I want them to write newsletters and give reports on the school. practice broadcasting, and to be on a college campus, particularly like yours or mine, where you've got, you know, the Pac-12 or SEC, and you've got all of these sport career professionals available. This is one of the reasons I changed universities and came to Mizzou, because I felt like this is a place where I can go around the university and say, you do something that can link with sport. I want you to come and speak to these kids. You know how to figure out what to charge for a ticket. And I've got some kids who might be interested in math that never thought of how this connected with sport. I want you to come and talk, you know. So that's really my hope with this, is really this cultural transformation that you speak of, Ken.
Yeah, Dr. Brooks, I'm so appreciative of your thought leadership in this space. It's certainly needed, and not enough of it's happening, frankly. Any final thoughts as we wrap up? We certainly will want to have you back on to continue our conversation, because I think Ken and I could go and talk with you for hours and hours on end, and so we'll continue conversation another day as well.
Well, I think my last thoughts really are about coaching, and we know, those of us, you know, the three of us and others who really study and are passionate about sport, we know how important coaches are, because we continue as a country to play this game just as we do with amateurism, that sports are extracurricular, but they have become curricular. This is a part of kids' social and personal identity. They find themselves to be whole when they're on a team or when they're personally that we don't have more uniform national programs on coaching that make sure that we are putting individuals that are in this leadership position, that we are making sure that they're trained well and that they are in the best position to give positive experiences to our youth.
Fantastic. And Dr. Brooks, if people want to follow your research or your thoughts, are there ways for them to do that?
Absolutely. So my website, you know, if you go through the university's website at University of Missouri in sociology, you've got my information there. I've got a couple of the different stories I've written in places where I've been cited. And then, of course, Black Men Can't Shoot, University of Chicago Press. It's available via Kindle as well as hardcover. And I'm working on this next book on coaching, tentatively titled All They Hear Is Yelling. And that's about coaches, and all they hear, all that parents and kids hear is the yelling, but it's really about the relationships that coaches are trying to build.
Great. And Twitter or no Twitter?
I have Twitter. It's Black Men Can't Shoot. BLK Men Can't Shoot.
Great. Hey, thank you so much for being on the show. I really enjoyed the conversation with you, and hope to continue it again in the future as well.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate you all and your work. Talk to you later.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.